What would you give up for someone you loved more than life itself? Would you lay down wealth? Would you leave behind comfort? Would you walk away from security? Joanna did all of this when she chose to follow Jesus. Her story is not often told in detail, yet hidden in her sacrifice is a picture of courage, faith, and love that still speaks to us. Today, Joanna was not an ordinary woman in her time. She lived within the circles of power and privilege. Her husband Chusa worked as a steward in the household of King Herod. This meant Joanna was part of an elite world. She had access to comfort servants, fine clothes, and the kind of security most people could only dream of. Every day she could walk the polished halls of Herod's palace, where whispers of politics and power filled the air. She was accustomed to stability. She was seen as respectable. She lived in a place where everything was decided by authority and wealth. But behind the veil of privilege, Joanna carried pain. The Bible tells us she was healed by Jesus. Though the scriptures do not describe in detail what she suffered, it is clear that her life was touched by brokenness. Whether it was sickness, torment, or a heavy burden, we may never know. Yet what we do know is this: she met Jesus and everything changed. In a world where her name was tied to luxury, her heart found something money could not buy. She found freedom. Imagine her first encounter with Jesus. Perhaps she had heard whispers among the crowds. People spoke of a teacher who healed the sick, who gave sight to the blind, who spoke words that stirred the soul. Perhaps curiosity drew her out from the palace gates. She stepped into the dusty roads where ordinary people gathered to see him. Then, in one moment that we cannot fully record, Jesus spoke into her pain and restored her. Her suffering was lifted. Her heart was set free. And that was the turning point. Joanna now stood at a crossroads. On one side was the life she had always known: wealth, privilege, and safety. On the other side was a road that led through villages, hills, and uncertainty. A road that followed a man despised by the rulers but loved by the broken. She knew what it would mean if she chose him. Her name could be ridiculed. Her position could be lost. Her security could vanish. Yet there was no hesitation in her spirit. The freedom and love she found in Jesus was greater than the comforts of a palace. From that moment, Joanna was no longer just a woman of position. She became a disciple, a follower who gave not only her heart, but also her resources to support the ministry of Jesus. In her sacrifice, we see a woman willing to trade earthly glory for eternal treasure. She discovered that true honor is not found in being served in a palace, but in serving the one who came to bring life to the world. The palace was full of noise, servants rushing back and forth, officials whispering about Herod's decisions, the heavy weight of wealth surrounding every room. Yet even in all that abundance, Joanna felt a quiet emptiness. She could wear fine garments and sit at decorated tables, but none of it answered the ache that lived inside her. One day, the news reached her ears. A man was traveling from town to town, not as a noble or a ruler, but as a teacher, a healer. He did not dress in robes of royalty, yet people said power flowed from his words. Some called him a prophet. Others said he was the Messiah, the promised one. His name was Jesus. Joanna listened to the stories they said. Demons fled at his command. They said the hopeless were filled with new life. They said even the lowest beggar walked away restored. And while others argued about his authority, Joanna wondered, could he be the one who could heal the emptiness in me? Could he free me from the shadow that followed my heart? Leaving the palace that day must have felt like stepping into another world. The streets were filled with dust voices, shouting, children running, merchants calling out the price of their goods. And there in the middle of it stood Jesus. Not on a throne, not with soldiers guarding him, but surrounded by fishermen, mothers, the poor, and the forgotten. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and in that gaze there was something she had never seen. In the polished halls of power, There was truth, and there was love. We do not know exactly what her pain had been. Perhaps an illness that drained her body. Perhaps a darkness that bound her mind. Perhaps scars she carried in silence. But whatever it was, Jesus reached into that hidden place and set her free. In that moment, the palace no longer defined her. The wealth no longer held her. The chains she carried for so long were broken. Joanna walked away, healed but more than healed. She walked away. Changed, she had touched real freedom. And it was nothing like the life she had known before. For the first time, she saw that following Jesus was not about losing, but about finding. It was not about giving up. It was about stepping into a greater treasure. That day was her turning point. The day she realized that the most powerful man she had ever met was not Herod the king she served under, but Jesus the king who served others. The palace might have looked rich, but Joanna knew the truth now. The true riches were found in walking beside him. The walls of Herod's palace rose high above the city, polished stone shining under the sun. Inside were halls filled with music, the fragrance of spices, the glitter of wealth. A place where every meal was a feast, and every garment was woven with care. This was the world Joanna knew. The world she could have remained in for the rest of her life. Safe, secure, comfortable. But imagine her now walking away from those walls, leaving behind the sound of polished sandals on marble floors, trading it for the crunch of dust beneath her feet. The servants who once hurried to meet her needs were gone. Instead, she joined fishermen who carried calloused hands and women who carried quiet faith. She was no longer surrounded by courtiers, but by the broken, the blind, the poor, and the hungry. This was no small cost. To step out of the palace was to risk her name, to risk her safety. For Joanna was tied to Herod's household, a place of politics and suspicion. Her choice to follow Jesus was dangerous. For the rulers despised him, they plotted against him, they feared his influence, yet she did not turn back. The same woman who had once been hidden behind the wealth of the court now chose the open road where rejection and persecution followed. What did she sacrifice? She gave up wealth. She gave up her standing. She gave up the comfort of being cared for in order to care for others. She gave her resources to support Jesus and his disciples. She gave her time to walk from village to village. She gave her name and risked it being stained with shame in the eyes of the powerful. But every sacrifice was not counted as loss. For Joanna had tasted something richer than gold. She had found freedom and truth. You see her there among the crowd. No crown upon her head, no fine robes on her shoulders. Just a woman with steady eyes and a willing heart, following a teacher who had no place to rest his head, sharing bread with strangers, carrying hope wherever she went. While the palace feasted, Joanna chose hunger with Christ. While the palace plotted, Joanna chose prayer. While the palace held fear, Joanna carried faith. This was her sacrifice, and it was not forced. It was not demanded. She gave it freely, for she had discovered that the treasures of the earth can fade, but the treasures of heaven endure forever. Joanna knew what most around her did not. To leave behind the palace was not to lose everything, but to gain the only thing that mattered, the rule. Roads were long and uneven. Each step stirred the dust that clung to her sandals. The air smelled of sweat, of earth, of bread carried in baskets for the journey. The palace had been filled with polished floors and shaded courtyards, but out here under the open sky there was no shade, no luxury, only the endless horizon stretching ahead. Yet strangely, this road felt more alive than any hall of marble ever had. Joanna walked with women like Mary Magdalene, Susanna, and others whose lives had also been touched by Jesus. They were not bound together by wealth or position, but by gratitude. Every story was different, but every story shared the same ending: freedom. They had been healed. They had been forgiven. They had been given back their lives, and Now they gave their lives back in return. She often thought about what it meant to serve Jesus. It was not glamorous. It was not celebrated in the way the palace celebrated wealth. Instead, it was carrying jars of water, finding bread for the disciples, preparing places for rest. It was giving from her own resources not to build a palace, but to keep the ministry moving from town to town. What others might have called small, she called sacred. For in every act she was serving the Son of God. At night, when the camp grew quiet, she would look at the faces around the fire, men who once fished for a living, now speaking of the kingdom of God. Women who had been rejected, now embraced as daughters of hope. Sometimes she looked at Jesus sitting silently. In the glow of the flames, his face calm, his presence steady. And in those moments, she realized that she was closer to true greatness than she had ever been in the courts of Herod. The journey was not without fear. Crowds sometimes pressed too close. Rulers whispered threats. Pharisees glared with suspicion. There were days when hunger gnawed at her stomach, nights when sleep was restless and broken. But in every hardship there was joy, for she was walking with the one who carried power greater than kings. She was watching blind eyes open, hearing lame feet, run seeing hearts once crushed by shame, now lifted in joy. This walk was more than a journey. It was her worship. Her sacrifice had led her here not to loss, but to a deeper love. Every mile on the road was a reminder of what she had left behind and what she had found. What once defined her was gone, and in its place was something eternal. Joanna was not just following Jesus. She was learning to live in the rhythm of his kingdom. Step by step, choice by choice. She walked a path that the world could not understand, but heaven could. The air that day was heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. Darkness covered the sky, though it was midday. The crowd pressed in loud, angry voices, mixing with the cries of the grieving. Joanna stood there, her heart pounding. Each hammer strike drove through her soul. Each shout of mockery pierced her deeper than any blade. She had walked away from a palace for this road, and now this road led to a hill, where the Son of God was nailed to a cross. She could have stayed away. She could have hidden in the safety of her name and her home. But no, her steps had led her here, to stand near the women who refused to leave, to watch her Lord hanging broken and bruised. When others fled in fear, she stayed, her eyes fixed on him, her tears falling into the dust below. This was not the king she once knew in Herod's halls. This was the true king, a king whose throne was a cross and whose crown was made of thorns. Hours passed, yet felt like eternity. She remembered the laughter of the journeys, the warmth of the firelight, the voice that spoke peace into her soul. And now that same voice cried out words of surrender. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then silence. The earth shook, and it seemed as though the whole world trembled with grief. Joanna clutched the shawl around her shoulders, her body shaking with sobs. She had lost the one she had given everything to follow, but the story did not end on that hill. Days later, while the city still buzzed with confusion, Joanna went with the other women to the tomb. The air was cold in the early morning, the ground still damp with dew. They carried spices to honor his body, their hearts heavy with sorrow. Yet when they arrived, the stone was rolled away. The tomb was empty. Fear and wonder filled her. Her eyes searched the shadows where death should have lingered. But there was no body. Instead, there was a voice. Angels declaring, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen." Joanna's heart leapt in her chest. She who had watched him die now became one of the first to witness the truth that death could not hold him. Her tears turned to awe. Her mourning turned to joy. She had walked away from a palace and into the hardest sacrifice of her life. But here in front of the empty tomb, she realized that nothing was lost. Everything was gained. Her choice had led her to the center of the greatest story the world would ever know. She had seen the cross. She had seen the empty grave. And she would carry this truth for the rest of her days. I once lived in rooms filled with marble and gold. I wore garments that shone in the sun. I heard the voices of rulers and servants and thought I was secure. But wealth cannot silence pain, and position cannot heal the soul. My life looked whole, but inside I was broken. Then Jesus found me and spoke a word that set me free. From that moment I knew no palace, no treasure, no comfort could compare to the freedom he gave. I walked away from all I had known. Some thought I was foolish. Some whispered my name in shame. But I did not care, for what is gold compared to love? What is comfort compared to truth? I gave my wealth, my time, my name, not because I was forced, but because I had seen the one who is worth more than all the kingdoms of this earth. I remember the roads, the hunger, the weariness, the long nights when fear pressed heavy on my chest. Yet I also remember the laughter around the fire, the faces of the healed, the songs whispered in the dark. We gave little by the world's measure, but to him it was enough. Every loaf of bread, every drop of water, every step of the journey became an offering to my King. I remember the cross, the sky turning black, the earth shaking beneath my feet. My heart broke as I watched him suffer. I thought everything was lost. Yet even in death I did not turn away, for I had given my life to him, and I would not abandon him even in his final hour. And then the tomb. The stone rolled away, the voice declaring that he is alive. That moment burned into my soul like fire. He had conquered the grave, and I knew my sacrifice was never in vain. If you ask me what I lost, I will tell you nothing. If you ask me what I gained, I will tell you everything. I left a palace, but I found a kingdom eternal. I gave up comfort, but I found a love that cannot die. I surrendered my life, but I found life everlasting. If I could choose again, I would choose the same path again and again. And now I speak not only for myself, but for you. The call is the same. Will you cling to the palaces of this world, or will you walk the road with him? The treasures of earth fade, but the treasures of heaven endure forever. I am Joanna, and this is my story of sacrifice, my story of freedom, my story of Jesus. Joanna's life is not remembered in long speeches or great monuments. Her name is only mentioned in a few short verses. Yet in those quiet lines lies the story of a woman who gave everything she had for the sake of Christ. She walked away from wealth for a greater treasure. She laid down comfort for a deeper love. She stood at the cross when fear silenced others. She ran to the tomb and found it empty. She became a witness of the greatest truth the world has ever known. Her story speaks to us now in whispers that are stronger than shouts. The question is not only what Joanna sacrificed, but what we are willing to sacrifice. The world offers palaces of its own wealth, comfort, recognition, security. They shine for a moment, then fade like dust. But the call of Jesus remains. Come, follow me. It is not an easy road. It will cost much, but it leads to life that never ends. Joanna discovered that sacrifice is not loss but exchange. The palace for the kingdom, the temporary for the eternal, the fleeting for the everlasting. Her choice reminds us that the value of a life is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give. Her story is a mirror asking us, what would you surrender for the one who surrendered all for you? So let her words echo in your soul. I left a palace, but I found a kingdom. Eternal. I left safety, but I found freedom. I left my name, but I found my life. And now the same invitation rests before you. Will you cling to what cannot last, or will you take hold of what cannot be taken away? This is not just Joanna's story, it is an invitation. It is a reminder, it is a call. And as her life whispers across centuries, it asks us to look at our own. What would you sacrifice for Jesus?